Hello and welcome back to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by Paul McGarraghy. How's it going, mate?
Hi, it's lovely to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you on as well, mate. So, Paul's inclusion in this week's show means we're going to be talking about CF Reus, a club from Catalonia in Spain, who he wrote quite a groundbreaking article on, actually, which was titled The Club That La Liga Killed. And today, we're going to be exploring the reasons why the article was called that and the reasons why some people think that. It's a very interesting club with a really interesting story, with a lot of controversy surrounding them. So, to kick us off, Paul, tell us a little bit about CF Reus and their history.
It's a club in a relatively small town. I think the population's only about 100,000 of Reus. It was founded in 1909. I think it was the 23rd of November, to be precise. In terms of how they were founded, they adopted the name the Clockwork Hazelnuts, part of the history and the industry around the area. As a club, they a bit of a yo-yo team. They never made it above the second tier, and it was only really in the latter years that they actually made it to the second division. Reus were founded as part of a sporting institution, as like a community hub. There's quite a few examples that you can still point to in Spain with regards to this. So that the easiest way to explain it is that some of these clubs, like I say, it's more of a community hub that has a multi-sport sort of affiliation. They had a good youth development system there. They had a good women's team that was relatively strong. And they grew to be a club that was part of the community. They may not have been obviously the most successful, but they were a cornerstone of the local area.
Yeah, you've covered the basics there. I think they weren't incredibly successful by any means, but they were rooted in their community, which often goes a long way, and you know, sometimes is a greater deal than any trophies or silverware can actually bring, you know. As far as I'm aware, they spent most of their existence as a regional side, to be honest, but somewhat unfortunately, the reason they got their 15 minutes of fame was because of the circumstances surrounding their demise. So let's jump straight to that. Tell us a little bit about the reasons that they ended up going defunct.
There is quite a lot to unpack in terms of the demise. So Reus is a town, as I mentioned, it's relatively small. It's population 100,000. It's got a large airport. It serves Salou. If anybody, I know a lot of Brits go on holiday to Salou, and you know, quite a lot of tourists do fly in there. So it used to get a lot of tourists coming through the city as well. And obviously, as we mentioned before, it's located in Catalonia and relatively close to Barcelona. So one of the things about its location and the tourist aspect is it's an important factor. It might not sound it in terms of a football club, but it is an important factor in terms of the way that the successive owners prior to the club's collapse, their motives in terms of purchasing it. So the easiest way to sort of strip everything back and keep the story simple, but also make sense in terms of following a linear pattern. There's a couple of names that might be familiar to people that I'm going to mention in a minute. But I think if we go back to, we got 2003. So 2003, Joan Laporta, who is the current FC Barcelona president, was also elected president of Barcelona, and he ran from 2003 to 2010. I think around about 2007, 2008, he gave the job of general manager to one of his friends, Joan Laporta. And these two guys got on well, obviously, and had success at Barcelona. And when Laporta's presidency ended in 2010, so if you think where FC Barcelona were in 2010, I mean, that's Guardiola's era, just about to face, well, they beat Manchester United Champions League final. Messi, David Villa, that front three, Messi, Villa and Pedro, with Xavi and Iniesta and Busquets in the midfield. You had a back four of, it was still Puyol for a time, and Piqué and Eric Abidal.
They were the best team in the world, and not just at that time. Just like how they played football and the things that they done really kind of defined that era.
It's one of the teams, and when you think of football at its best, it's that model and that style of play is what people still, you know, if you see any highlights, it's hard not to be impressed in it, really.
Yeah, exactly.
So Laporta's presidency ends at that point where, you know, Barca are pretty much on top of the world. I mean, literally, they were the world champions, weren't they? So him and Oliver decide that they're going to carry on working together in the football industry, and they had a few investments. And one of the things that they decided to do a couple of years later was to take out they went into an agreement to purchase CF Reus, and I believe, bearing in mind it's been a couple of years since I saw any of the documentation when I was reporting on the club, but I think it was a 51% split for Joan Oliver, and the other 49% was split between Laporta and a couple of others of their friend circle, shall we say. So Joan Oliver was the main figurehead. He was the CEO, and Laporta basically tasked him as the guy who would oversee the day-to-day running of the club, and that they had aspirations of taking the club to at least challenging for the top end of the second tier. And like, as we said in the beginning, this was a club that had never really been higher than, the lower half of the second division. But they thought, well, we've got enough there infrastructure-wise. It's in a great location. We might get people passing by who are on the holiday that'll leave the resort and come into the town for a game of football, etc. So they started putting a bit of money in. And as I mentioned, they did have other investments in the football world, including links to club in China. Beijing, the name is a series of letters, but it basically stands for like Computer Institute or University Institute of Computing or something like that. It's Beijing based, and they had a minority stake in there. So these were people who, they had money and they had influence and connections across the football world. They've got ambitions to build the club up. Things don't materialise the way that they want over the next 5 years. Getting to the summer of 2018, the club's not necessarily kicking on as much as they might have liked. Some of the money isn't... Well, the television money at that time, there was a different TV deal and different rules around TV deals. So the second division basically got a very small slice of pie that was split between every club. It was like, it was a smaller television deal than League One in England. I'm not sure if it's Scottish Premier, but it was slightly bigger than the Scottish second tier. So given that in the league above, you've got Barcelona and Real Madrid, who at the time were essentially printing their own money for TV. It was Messi, Ronaldo, so they were making multi-million, bordering billions through TV. Another thing that put it into a bit of context, the second tier in Spain for a long while was available for free on YouTube. The viewing figures were not great, even though it was a free product that was accessible to a world audience. That the viewing figures were shocking, really.
Well, that's quite interesting in itself, actually. But to be fair, it doesn't seem like the FA had a lot of interest in helping clubs outside of the top tier. But also the regional leagues in Spain, as far as I understand, like other leagues in Europe, can be a bit complex to navigate and progress through. Has it always been like that? Do you know?
So it's kind of historically it was very regionalised anyway as a sport across Spain, and it is pretty much below third tier now. It is again, it's regionalised in the same way. It's not really changed much since then, to be fair. And part of that reason is because of travel costs and also just the sheer number of clubs. At that level, you are talking semi-professional to, in some cases, essentially amateur sides. Below the third tier, you'll see it in the Copa del Rey. There'll be, I think the other year there was a club that was based in Madrid that was a bunch of taxi drivers, near enough.
Yeah, I suppose it might be a bit of a misconception then that Spain is more professional teams than people think. I mean, it's certainly something that maybe naively that I thought would have been the case, but I guess the top three leagues are pretty substantial and pretty big anyway. But to be fair, I think that might be the case with most people and what they think of leagues in Europe is that, particularly for nations like Italy and Spain, and maybe even Portugal, that once you get past like the third, fourth and fifth tier, they're still kind of professional in some ways. So I don't know if that's something you'd agree with.
You'll have it's been rebranded recently, but it's essentially a similar model. So you'll be fourth tier would have Primera RFEF, and then you'd have groups within that, and it is relatively regionalised. I think it was last season or season before, there was one of the clubs that was sort of out on its own, basically in the north, but there was too many teams from the north, so they got lumped into the south. And it obviously meant that there was significantly higher travel costs for them, and they didn't get any compensation for the travel. So it was quite a big. They did put a campaign on, and locals contributed money. I think we saw a similar thing in England at the end of the COVID season with Dover Athletic, and they were trying to get into the National League, but they were in the National League South, and it was so. But yeah, with Spain, it's heavily regionalised, and a lot of that has to do with the lack of money and just the history of it. But as you mentioned, it's a country that is for certainly in the last 15 years or 20 years, it's been one of the most dominant footballing nations on the pitch, but it's also a country that is football mad. So
yeah, absolutely.
In that sense, not having a stronger pyramid, I guess it makes it an outlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing, because obviously, we kind of said at the start that CF Reus didn't have a lot of success, and I suppose by success, what we really meant by that was trophies or European runs. But in actuality, considering what you've just mentioned in terms of the footballing pyramid in Spain, obviously they had quite a bit of financial investment, but
yeah, predominantly they were in like the third and fourth division for the vast majority of their lifespan, really.
Yeah, so they were a bit of a yo-yo club, and while they never really pulled up any trees, I suppose their peak was when they went on a kind of run in the Copa del Rey. They reached the last 32, which is pretty decent for a club of their level, and they had a wee run there, so it wasn't all doom and gloom. And even for the level that they were playing at, they still managed to get a few promotions. So the fans at least, had a few things to cheer about. But of course, away from what was going on the field, CF Reus are sadly more known for what was happening off the field, as we said earlier on. So let's go back to the investments that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, so the investment weren't as prosperous as they would have liked. So going into the 2018-19 season, that summer, the finances weren't looking great. It wasn't completely risky at that stage, but as we got to November, it started appearing on people's radars that the club needed change of owners in order to not so much survive at that point, but in terms of being able to move forward. Players had not been paid, and then so there's a convention called CFreus, and the one in 2018, I think that took place mid-November in Miami, and that's where the next ownership actually became aware of the club. So I'll get onto that in a moment. But by the end of 2018 calendar year, the club needed investment, and Oliver and Laporta had essentially decided that they'd had enough. So the club was put up for sale, almost discreetly, although people who were in attendance at CFreus in Miami had been sort of given the heads up that this Spanish second tier team was available for purchase. I should say as well, actually, that there were other clubs at CFreus that were up for sale, and the owners who came in were Clifton Anolfo, Russell Platt, and a gentleman called Kurt Anolfo, who is Clifton's brother. Yeah, if there's any people familiar with the MLS, you'll know the name Bruce Arena. He was the LA Galaxy manager when David Beckham was there. He was the coach of the US men's national team for a period. He was also the coach of the New England Revolution about 2 years ago when they broke all the records and won trophy after trophy. So he's a big name, and his assistant manager was Kurt Anolfo. So Kurt Anolfo, Clifton Anolfo, the two brothers, and Russell Platt essentially formed a consortium, and they were on the lookout to buy a club. And they looked at a couple, including one in Scotland. And so yeah, they'd looked in Scotland and a couple of other projects. And they wanted something that could be a long-term investment. So Kurt was still working as an assistant. Russell and Clifton are in the real estate business. So they wanted something that as the main careers started to wind down, that they could go to essentially enjoy as a labour of love, I guess, really. Yeah. So they were on the lookout for a purchase, and at CFreus, they were offered the opportunity to make inquiries with CF Reus, and they did. They did take interest. They were also, as I mentioned, looking at other clubs, and the one that they looked at in Scotland was the one that they particularly liked the idea of to begin with, given its location. It's not Glasgow, by the way, but the financial situation there at that club put them off. Essentially, it had debts larger than they would have been prepared to take on, and it would have meant that the long-term project would have needed a lot more short-term attention than they were ready to give at the time. So after looking at the Scottish club, they went back to look at Reus. At the same time, there was another person of note that was interested in buying Reus, a guy called Gerard Piqué, who, happened to be the Barcelona captain at the time. So he's been on the lookout. Obviously now he's since bought FC Andorra, and they're linked to this story as well, actually, and it's a particularly sore point for fans of Reus. So I'll come back to them shortly. So Piqué had looked at buying Reus, and I honestly don't know. I never got a clear answer when I was interviewing Clifton and Olfo, and I don't think he knew for certain either himself as to whether Piqué didn't have enough money to meet the valuation, or if he just was put off the idea of the project. But ultimately, Piqué decided he didn't want to proceed with purchasing Reus, and the American investors, they wanted to press ahead. So in December, things started to progress off the field in terms of change of ownership. The Americans started looking at the books and realizing that there was financial trouble that they would have to deal with, but they believed that they had time to do it. And from what the information they were given in terms of the books, they felt that it was something that they could easily overcome in terms of seeing out the season and then starting afresh over the summer. But on the field, Reus were not necessarily having the best of times, and the playing staff were starting to worry because they'd not been paid, and in some cases they opted to defer wages so that the backroom staff and the non-playing staff at the club, that the kit men and the tea room ladies, etc., could get their wages.
I think it's one of the things that when a football club's in a bit of financial bother, it's really the sign that they're on this kind of unstoppable downward spiral when they can't pay wages at all. And then obviously new owners come in and they maybe think, okay, this is going to be fine. But once a club actually gets to that stage, in fact, even before that stage, it's very, very, very difficult to get back out of it and kind of maintain the same position you were in.
Absolutely. No, you're 100% right. And ultimately, it's always kind of sad anyway, because it's the people who you only ever think of a club in terms of the players and maybe the directors, but there's that many people that work for these institutions that is their full-time job. Somebody who's
absolutely
there to make sure the kit's washed, and somebody who's there to clean the toilets, or make sure the stadium's ready. There's that many people connected that it's always tragic when you see people going out without wages, because then those people are not on footballers' wages. So anyway, without digressing too much, there's definitely enough misery to come. So let's buckle up. As I mentioned, by December, the Americans had decided to go ahead with the deal, but it was apparent that Reus had a debt of, I think it was approximately 5.2 million in total. And as we spoke before, this is a small club that's not really getting the large TV money that comes in, once, twice a season, or in lumps that, you would in the top tier, etc. So at the time, La Liga issued several warnings saying, you must pay your players, pay the wages, etc. They were warned that if there's no payment, then that there could be further sanctions on the club, and that the outgoing ownership, Joan Oliver and Joan Laporta, they, as far as they're concerned, they're selling the club, so that they're not really interested in doing anything to help the situation. So La Liga gave a deadline. I think initially it was 15 days to get the deal done and to get some of these wages paid. And that takes us into January. Wages weren't paid. The club still had to try and fulfill its fixtures. There was instances where players took to the field, and then just before kick-off, I think there's a famous photo of them one of the B teams gathering at the centre circle, one of their games to protest.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say, as you said, things were going terribly for them on the field too. Things were really starting to unravel at this point. They only won 5 games that season, and I think all the signs were pointing to a club that was really on its last legs.
Absolutely, yeah. I think the first month, just thinking back to when I was doing these interviews, I think the first month where the club essentially defaulted on wages was September, but then I think there was some small payments made in between that carried it over into the new year. It was on and off, and it was like, right, okay, this month first team will be paid, next month reserve team up. It was a situation like that, and I can't think of a football club that is having off the field financial trouble and yet manages to play well on the field at the same time. Yeah. The usual two things are linked usually, aren't they? Anyway, so the agreements gets put in place for the Americans to take over, and they're given documentation by Javier Tebas, the head honcho, essentially at La Liga. He's still there. I would say he's a divisive character. People who follow Spanish football tend to have a strong opinion on him one way or the other. And the outgoing ownership had put together a set of accounts and presented that to the incoming one, and it looked like it was a manageable situation to an extent. And Clifton Anolfo was due to fly in on behalf of the consortium. I think it's the third week of January. He was supposed to fly in on the Friday for a meeting on the Monday. And whilst he is in the air on the Friday afternoon, Tebas, or somebody acting on Tebas's behalf at La Liga, issued a statement saying, we appreciate that the sale's not gone through yet, but the club hasn't paid wages, and so we are looking to suspend the club from the league. So as a new owner arriving from America to land in a foreign country and, expect to have a clear meeting with La Liga to complete the purchase of a football club, to actually just walk up there and to be told by the local press, actually, what do you make of this statement? And he'd not actually read it himself. It was the press that told him about it. So, it was quite a frustrating and difficult thing for him.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember.
Not ideal at all.
No, I remember speaking to him. This would have been April when I first did an interview with him, and he was understandably still furious about it then. So things move forward. He gets a little bit more time from La Liga to complete the deal. The deal does go ahead, and the ownership change, I think that took place. It went into February when it was fully signed and sealed. But at that point, the players and such still hadn't been paid because of the fact that the money was not really in place from the new owners, and that the outgoing owners had essentially just walked out the door with,
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the worst possible things that can happen in football, because at the end of the day, it's really just rich people playing games with the lives of other people and their careers. And at the end of the day, as we said earlier, it's not just the players of the senior management, but it's the kit men, the groundskeepers, the catering people. There are all these people affected by businessmen playing games with small community football clubs, and sadly, that business person could just easily walk into another football club the next day and repeat the process. I should have said at the time as well, but it was good of the players to defer wages so that those people kind of in the background could get paid, if you want to say that, because they're the people that really are the lifeblood of a football club and keep it ticking. So it's just a really, really sad byproduct of modern football, to be honest.
Absolutely. On that note, it's probably worth me sort of giving a bit of an insight as to what the new owners had planned for the club. So as I mentioned, two of the owners, Clifton Anolfo and Russell Platt, they made their money from the real estate market. So for them, a big part of the project was also the redevelopment of the facilities, and to make it, the simplest way of looking at a football club is that, if it's in the top flight of, 20 teams in the league, 19 home games a season, it's going to make, you expect to make money. So if you're a football club owner, you think there's only 19 weekends in a rolling 12-month period where the income's going to be there. So how do I make the facilities more profitable on a regular basis? So that might be to make it a multi-sport venue, or to have, community facilities there, etc. So the owners, the Americans had essentially hired a architect to redesign a new stadium that would have been 18,000 seater. It would have had proper community facilities and an attached youth academy as well. The existing stadium, my pronunciation's not great, but I think it was called the Beish Camp. The club didn't own that outright. It was the legal owners of it were the local council essentially. So the plan was, we'll buy the stadium and we'll redevelop it and we'll make it so that it's not just football that takes place there, but there's other things as well, and that all year round there should be some form of revenue for that site.
And very ambitious planning. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think what's essential to that, I remember speaking with Mr. Analfo about this. One of the things that made Reus as a town a really good option for that is the fact that it's located next to a large international airport. It's close to a very tourist busy area of Spain, Salou. It's got the amusement park. It's got water parks nearby. It gets wonderful weather. It's close enough to Barcelona, and it's got good transport links. So in terms of a hub, you could go on there on holiday. You could do your theme park. You could do you could go on the water slides. You could go to the beach. You could go and sightsee in Barcelona, but you could have a hotel in Reus and taking a football match as well. As there's some good cuisine around there if you're into food and drink as well. So it had a lot going for it.
It makes sense, but the sounds of things, it's maybe one of the things that wasn't there previously. So definitely ambitious. I mean, they're certainly saying all the right things that fans want to hear when a new owner steps in and the club's been in a bit of trouble beforehand.
Yeah, and the footballing terms as well. So Kurt Analfo, as I mentioned, he was working with Bruce Arena in the MLS in America, but through their network of friends that they built up over the years in the industry, they were able to get a pre-agreements for player exchanges and youth development contracts with Toronto FC, Los Angeles FC, who were due to start. I think were they due to start in the 2019 MLS season. I think that was supposed to be their inaugural one. And they had a pre-agreement with Miami as well at the time. David Beckham had, decided he was going to set up a Miami club. I don't think he'd come up with the name yet, but they had an agreement. Analfo and Platt, they are based in Miami and also have an office in New York, but they were predominantly from Miami anyway, so they had connections there. And it was agreed that some of the promising young players from Reus would, in the off-season for Spain, they would travel to North America where the season's still ongoing and do a bit of extra training there and vice versa. So there was, it had a proper football project about it as well. And the idea was, we'll build it sustainably. It won't be, we'll try and do everything overnight. It will be a long-term ambition and we'll do it the right way. So he's travelled from America to Spain with a meeting scheduled to take place with Javier Tebas that's supposed to take place on the 28th of January. But by February, Mr. Analfo is still in Spain. The deal to purchase the club has gone ahead, but he's not actually been able to do anything with it. And what was supposed to be an initial 2-week trip ended up being, I think he said he was there 12 weeks straight in the end, trying to get things sorted. But from that meeting on the 28th of January onwards, the footballing operation ground to a halt. La Liga issued their notice to say that the club had been initially suspended, and then it was given a 3-year ban from playing in the second tier.
Okay.
Effectively, what that meant was that the club, even though the deal had gone through and the Americans were ready to spend their money, the club, because it had been kicked out, went into a form of administration. So none of the things could function until the outstanding debts had been paid and it had been the keys to the office, shall we say, had been released from the local court. So you've got start of the year, January, you've got players without pay who are still turning out and to an extent putting in a shift on the pitch, not getting results, but that's by the by in the grand scheme of things. To early February, you've got new owners, but no team, and you've just been kicked out of the league. It escalated very quickly. One of the things that sort of caused that to happen was that, as I mentioned before, it was 5.2 or 5.3 million in terms of debt that was initially explained when the deal was to go ahead. But when the deal had been signed, there was an extra set of accounts and other creditors that came forward and said, well, actually...
Yeah, I was going to say, was it not something closer to like £9 million or €9 million or something to that effect?
That's the thing. It ended up being, I think, closer to 9. So, it's double what had been anticipated. And understandably so, the US owners had been concerned and said, well, we would at least need more time to settle those debts. And this isn't what we'd been sold. And from what I'm about to say now, I'm very wary that this could be taken as being my version of the history, but this isn't. What I'm about to say is the version of events that Clifton and Olfo told me when I interviewed him, and it's in the articles that I wrote at the time, is he believes that Javier Tebas knew about these other debts. In his opinion, he just wanted to make an example out of CF Reus, and he didn't really care as long as the deal went through. So this is his version of events in terms of the situation with Tebas. Now, just to sort of add a bit more of a dimension to the motivations of Tebas, again, this next bit is another point that Clifton and Olfo mentioned to me in the interview, that Tebas is he's a very proud patriot for the Spanish state, apparently. And obviously, Reus were a Catalan club, and Laporta is somebody that, having been at Barcelona as the president for a period of time, I believe that there was some friction between the two of them. And Mr. Arnolfo felt that when he stepped into the situation as owner of Reus, he believed that La Liga had already decided that they were going to make an example out of this club. So I mean that's his take on how the dynamic was, and as to why there wasn't more flexibility given. Okay. So that leads us to how the wheels turned. Now, on top of the 9 million debt that they found, it was also noted that for the first week in February, there was approximately 3 million worth of television rights that Reus had been owed from the first half of the season and the sort of the last quarter of the season prior that had not been paid by La Liga. Now, Mr. Arnolfo tells me that when he took over the club and he was presented with this additional debt, he said, well, if you to La Liga, if you pay us that the outstanding television rights and allow us to use what he described it, and it was an American term that he saw it as he wanted to use an escrow account to help see out the season for the team. So it would mean that in a way that the club would take an advance to help cushion the blow of the outstanding debt, and then over the course of the summer, whilst that was going on, at least the club was playing its games, and then the American owners would come out with a financial arrangement with the people that they owed debt to. But La Liga refused to provide the outstanding television money, according to Mr. Arnolfo. So that meant that the size of the debt that needed to be settled in order for them to be able to return to playing football was just too difficult for them to overcome. And obviously, as owners, they felt that they'd been missold and not given a fair hearing by La Liga. The club goes into administration, and when it goes into administration, there's not really a lot that the new owners can actually do. The administrator comes in and he takes over and tries to settle the debt, and if he can avoid liquidation, then that's what he'll do. But this dragged on for a few months and eventually for a few years. It was a while later, I think it was about 18 months later, when the club was actually liquidated because it fulfilled the debts. It is a sad story, and one of the things that comes about with it, I mentioned a few other people before, and I just want to go back to them. So obviously, to begin with Laporta. So in the last interview that I did with Clifton and Olfo, it was during the pandemic. I remember I was working from home at the time, and he was working from his house, so it was all over Zoom. I think we're talking maybe May or April 2020. He had found more documentation showing that payments had gone from Reus to Laporta and to Joan Oliver, and that not only had the payments gone to them, the payments had also gone to some people in China that were not direct employees of CF Reus, but it looked like essentially that the club was paying money or consultancy fees to the Beijing team, which is Beijing Institute of Technology Football Club. Yeah, so he uncovered these documents, and there is photographs of them in the article. He let me have fair use of them, shall we say? So I have been able to publish some of the documentation that he uncovered on there. So it does show the money going to Laporta and it goes and going to China, and this was things that he tried to question with Tebas and say, something's not right here. And obviously when Joan Laporta's running again for presidency in 2021, Barcelona, Clifton Anolfo was very vocal on the at the time on social media saying, excuse me, you've left a big mess in Reus that you need to come and settle. Again, now that's what he says. The words in the interview that are published on the Over the Bar website are his words. I've not got Joan Laporta's number. I can't get his side of things.
There's different levels too, because reading about it only gives you some sense of what happened. You're talking various levels of corruption amongst one of the world's top sporting institutions, political stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm another person that I mentioned earlier on was Gerard Piqué. So he goes off and buys FC Andorra. Now, when Reus were kicked out of La Liga, and if you think to the beginning of the episode, we started talking about the complexities of the Spanish football pyramid. Rather than just promoting an extra team from the third tier, because of the way that the groups are laid out, they essentially marketed off Reus's spot in the second tier to the highest bidder. So you know where this is going.
Absolutely.
One of them was Yeda, but the club that ended up getting it was.
Hold on, let me guess. I'm going to take a wild swipe and say that it was FC Andorra.
Exactly. Now, if somebody was to put this as a script and present it as being like a Netflix drama, everyone would be like, it's too interconnected, too corrupt to believe.
That's the thing. It makes for a class story, and obviously, sadly for CF Reus, they were on the worst possible end of that, but it's a really, really incredible story.
I think it's something that they want to sweep under the carpet, and Mr. Anolfo he's definitely got a lot of documents that could tell a wider story, and
yeah, I mean, as you said at the beginning, your article was called "The Club That La Liga Killed," so it really stands out. And when you put the case across with the evidence that you have, you can't really argue against that, to be honest, can you? And you saw it too in the Palermo episode with Adrian from They Think Kits. They got done on a technicality, and there was a really strong feeling that the FA and FIGC had cheated them. So it's kind of similar here in many ways. And then you add in the political elements and the massive web of interconnecting subplots that are tied to CF Reus and the wider story. It's absolutely incredible. It really is. Do you think, given Barcelona's recent financial troubles, it's made CF Reus fans a little bit bitter about their situation? Because I think there's an interesting point to be made in that as well.
Yeah. So I still have Reus fans that follow me on social media, which it's very kind of them. And at the time, they were very keen to reach out and in some cases come to me for news, and I was like, well, it's not as easy as me just anyway. Yeah, I think it definitely makes the situations much more painful for them. If you think about this story, it could happen to any football club. In some ways, there are some parallels with what happened to Reus with what happened to Bury Football Club. Two successive owners where things didn't go well, and ultimately a club being kicked out of the league, where the fans are the ones that really suffer. So with Barcelona, we're all outsiders looking in. Obviously, a lot of these problems are ones that have come about over the last decade, really, for the club. That it's not that we can say that it's one instance of mismanagement. There's a lot of factors that have come to put Barcelona in the situation that they're currently in. And for me, the way that Barcelona have been able to manage it, which again is a sore point for Reus fans, the way that Barcelona essentially have been given special dispensation is purely down to the size of the club. And I mean that in two ways. One, because they have such a large revenue stream that even with being in mountains of debt, they've still had a larger cushion that they've been able to sustain such a hit to their bank balance, but continue to function. So that's one. A club like Reus, even if you put the proportion of Barcelona's bank balance is X and their debt is Y. If you were to scale that down to Reus would not be able to have the same financial money through the door, even though, how do I say it now? So money coming in through the door that isn't theirs, but is enough for them to carry on being able to function as a hollow shell. And obviously Barcelona's palencas, as the buzzword was, in terms of being able to sell off image rights, other clubs haven't got that luxury. So that's point one. And point two, because of the size of club and brand that Barcelona are, La Liga couldn't afford to have them fold, in my opinion. What it would do to the league, and I'm somebody who absolutely loves La Liga. I do. I think it's, in the main, it has been one of the more technical leagues. It's been one of the more entertaining ones. I know a lot of people think it's a two-team league. I completely get that, but I also think that there's so many side stories and subplots and various other things going on that it is a league that doesn't necessarily get the respect it deserves. But even with my biased view about it being such a good league to watch and enjoy, I think losing FC Barcelona would make it an incredibly difficult product to sell. So I think that is another reason why La Liga have given Barcelona special dispensation, shall we say.
Yeah, well, you only have to look to Rangers here in Scotland, where they were basically given a wee bit of special dispensation themselves and a little bit of a helping hand and allowed to reform at the bottom of the SPFL instead of, for example, Gretna, who had to start from the very bottom of the Scottish pyramid, or what is now the Scottish pyramid. And I know they're not directly comparable with their financial situations, and the context there is important. I can't stress that enough. But the point remains the same, in that I think bigger clubs in any league will always get forms of preferential treatment, regardless of the situation, if it looks like they're going to go defunct. And I think your point about it making La Liga a much more difficult product to market is pretty important in that respect too.
No, absolutely. It's a fascinating story. I hope I've done the club some justice there in terms of presenting it again.
It's been absolutely fantastic, and the story's brilliant. And as you said earlier on, it seems quite likely that some more will come out in the wash about them at some point, whether it's down the line, if there's documents released, if there's documents found, if it's just stuff that pops back up in interviews. So it's obviously the case, even though that CF Reus are gone in the sense of a playing football team, their stories living on and their names kind of living through these things that keep unraveling about them, which is an interesting dynamic. And I mean, do you think that they could ever maybe come back down the line? Have they already came back in an amateur sense?
There's been efforts made for a Phoenix club, and for a while, Mr. Anolfo was helping out with that. He told me he'd been trying to assist prior to Reus's final liquidation. He'd been working with the local community, but I don't know to what extent he was involved in terms of getting them now. I know that they separated the youth setup from the legal entity of CF Reus in order to protect it from being part of the liquidated assets, shall we say. And I think now there is a club that goes by the name of Reus, and I think it's like the Roy Negri. It's in the local language rather than more general Spanish, I would say. And like we touched on before, football clubs are part of the community, and when everyone goes out of
Absolutely.
business, doesn't matter what part of the world it's in, it's always sad, and it means that it doesn't have its 3:00 kickoff on a Saturday, or doesn't have, at the time, Reus were averaging crowds of 2,500, so it wasn't a full capacity, but it was still, it's still a lot of people that suddenly have a lot more spare time on their,
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully they come back in some iteration in the future. But it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, Paul, and your expertise on this subject is obviously something that we wanted to pull on and get you in to chat about. So thank you very much for coming on. It's been great.
No, thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed it.
Good, so we certainly enjoyed it as well. Thank you to everyone who tuned into this episode. If you want to go out and check more of Paul's work, then please have a look on overthebar.com, I think his website is. If not, it's overthebarfb on Twitter. And of course, if there's another topic that you would like us to cover related to football history, heritage, culture, identity, or community, you can reach us on X. Feel free to DM us at _footyheritage, or you can email us at hello@footballheritage.co.uk. And please don't be afraid to check out our website either, which is footballheritage.co.uk. Some fantastic work going out there right now, some written content from our fantastic contributors. So please go and check that out. But for now, Paul, say goodbye.
Thanks, lovely.
And it's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.